Stop me if you think you've heard this one before. Girl seeks boy by putting ad in a Lonely Hearts magazine. Girl finds boy. Boy plans to con girl for her cash. Boy winds up dead. Girl winds up charged with murder. Ah yes, a tale as old as time. It's Season 1, Episode 20 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Lonely Heiress. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple. Provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as I did last episode, I plan to get to some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode, I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler where, just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each week in the Law Library, we return to prior episodes to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. In this episode's visit to the Law Library, we consider the benefit of Perry's going back to the scene of the crime. We see this first in the case of the nervous accomplice, where Perry decides that playing armchair detective can only get him so far.
Paul, let me get this straight. Your man saw Roxy Howard take a lot of junk out of here and toss it into the gully in back of her place?
That's right. He made a complete inventory. There were some small sandbags, a few clamps, some pieces of iron pipe, 2x4s, and, oh yeah, a stool.
Where's the gully?
Come on, he showed me everything before he left.
So, he goes back out to the site where George Lutz was murdered. He discovers a supply shack and a pile of sand and proceeds to unlock the case. We should distinguish investigative trips back to the scene of the crime from Perry's penchant for discovering crime scenes with the body still present. If we're including those kinds of cases, it's almost easier to name instances where this doesn't happen than ones where it does. It often gets Perry into hot water, and in the case of the Sunbather's Diary, he was suspected by Berger of actually aiding and abetting the murder.
Did you recognize the man who stood at the window and signaled to Miss Dowling?
Yes, sir.
What was his name?
Perry Mason.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've just heard the testimony of Detective Myers. It completely contradicts the testimony of the previous witness. I therefore ask you to bring in an indictment for perjury against Perry Mason.
I bring all this up because in today's episode, Perry and Della return to the crime scene to check a police theory of the crime and find that it's true. Yet, when Della continues to think about how to explain the theory's validity, she inadvertently helps Perry discover the case's true solution.
Della, I love you. You're a positive genius.
What'd I say?
Come on, let's go. Let's get out.
What about the champagne?
We'll leave it for the manager.
That sounds like a segue to me. Without further ado, let's get to the plot of our episode. The Case of the Lonely Heiress. This show's murder victim is conman country boy Barnaby, a slick operator who uses his aw shucks charm to pick up bilk and then dump rich, lonely women.
Barnaby. The name is Barnaby this trip. Now get it right, will you?
This episode, he thinks he's seducing a rich, beautiful heiress. Well, Marilyn Cartwright really is rich. It's the seduction part that's kind of up in the air. Country boy has two accomplices, Dolores, his Spitfire girlfriend who poses as his wife when they're ready to blow off the woman country boy is currently seducing.
She can tear a hotel room apart in 30 seconds flat. It's the doggonedest blow-off you ever saw.
And Mr. Edmund Lacey, the man who publishes Lonely Hearts Calling magazine, the seedbed for country boys' evil schemes. Lacey is perhaps the most unctuous man to ever appear on the show, and throughout the episode he's covered in a layer of flop sweat. In any other episode, I would have put my betting money on this dude being the murder victim, but here he just gets our plot going by consulting Paul Drake about a possible fraud case. A woman that's too good to be true, both attractive and rich, has placed an ad in Lonely Hearts Calling, and now Lacey must either find her to prove she's real or give back the considerable profits he's made through her advertisement.
I'm 23 with a face and figure men whistle at. I yearn to meet some nice young man who could be interested in me and not the fortune I recently inherited. I prefer the simple outdoor type. Address all replies, box 96, care of this magazine. Now, Mr. Lacey, you say this ad appears in your magazine, Lonely Hearts Calling?
You're thinking the ad is a fraud, aren't you, Mr. Drake?
It's odd enough to encounter Drake before we get to Mason. What's doubly odd is that Drake offers some ingenious as well as expensive advice to Lacey about how to locate Marilyn Cartwright to verify her story.
I am a poor young man. So when I read in your advertisement that you were rich, I decided to write you immediately. To tell the truth, I would have written if you were as ugly as they come. But if you're half as pretty as you say, I can hardly wait to meet you.
Of course, Lacey is merely using Drake because once Lacey gets Country Boy involved to gull Miss Cartwright out of her cash, he cuts Paul out. But our intrepid PI pulls Perry into the case because he's worried about his own liability, and it's nice to see Paul demonstrate a little creative know-how. The show never affords him that opportunity when he's working on an assignment that Perry gives him. Country Boy has unsuspectingly crossed the wrong woman. In the recent past, Barnaby's con game led a young woman to commit suicide after she got pregnant. Marilyn Cartwright was that young woman's sister, and now, with money to burn and an axe to grind, she plans to con the con man.
It was my idea, Mr. Mason. George tried to dissuade me, but I wanted to track Barnaby and the woman. I wanted to turn them over to the police the minute that they left town with my money.
So it all went exactly as you planned.
All except the murder.
And it's Marilyn who gets accused of murdering him. The scriptwriter keeps the audience in the dark. The scriptwriter, Donald S. Sanford, he's running a kind of con game too, because one of the early questions in the episode is whether or not Marilyn has really fallen for Country Boy's shtick. We know that Country Boy's a fraud, but has he worked his magic on Marilyn? The actual murderer is Dolores, Country Boy's accomplice, who actually seems murderous at least 2 different times before she confesses to the crime in court. When she bops Barnaby on the head during the blow-up with Marilyn, she tells the police it's her blow that killed Barnaby, before the police assure her that no, her paramour was poisoned.
I do it 100 times before. Only this time I killed my darling. Me, I killed my darling.
No, you didn't kill him, Dolores. He was poisoned.
After Mason has a conversation with her about the whereabouts of Edmund Lacey during the blow-up, she takes a gun and 5 bullets to the sweaty man's office and tries to murder him. She screams at him in Spanish and fires bullets left and right.
Murderer. Asesino. Cobarde.
Lacey survives, but he gets carted off to jail, and Dolores goes back to the stand as an important prosecution witness. The real dilemma for Perry and Della is just how the poison got into the champagne bottle. After returning to the scene of the crime, they realize the poison had to have been in the bottle before it was opened, and that Marilyn was one of the targets too. They discover the solution, or at least Perry does. Someone must have used a syringe to introduce the poison through the champagne cork. When Perry confronts Dolores about her purchase of a long needle, she at first says she needs it for diabetes treatment, but when Perry asks her if she needs a needle that's this long to do it, she has to confess to her crime of passion.
I beg, I cry, but he only laughs at me. And I say, okay, Charlie, I love you. If this girl is what you want, I don't make trouble. He think I mean it. He cannot understand that I never give him up. He is mi vida, my life.
Dolores was both smarter and more emotional, just listen to that speech, than we had been led to believe. Another con game of the audience by the writer Donald Sanford. Perry, Della, and Paul closed the episode in Perry's office, explaining that Country Boy was actually going to marry Marilyn Cartwright. If Dolores had not interceded, Marilyn might have been caught in her own trap. The implication is that private vendettas are too costly. Now let's compare the television plot with the 1948 novel. This is one of those novels that when you read it and then compare it to the television episode, you leave with a whole lot of respect for TV writers like Sanford, who managed to make radical changes to the book and yet pull it off. The book is pretty different, so let's nail down some of those differences. The setup. In the book, the magazine editor, who's named Robert Caddo, comes to Perry, not Paul, to help him find his lonely heiress. Now, the editor is different in another way. He's married, not just having a fling with his secretary. Robert Caddo's wife is the one who likes to put the fear of God into the editor's paramours by tearing a room apart. This is apparently the inspiration for the Dolores character. The defendant. We do have a lonely heiress named Marilyn, but she isn't an heiress yet. She's waiting for the court to decide on her case. Marilyn's mother nursed an old rich man who despised his family. And this dead tycoon made Marilyn's mom his sole heir. And when Marilyn's mother died tragically in a car accident, all of her newfound riches went to Marilyn. The problem is that the murder victim in the book, another nurse, now has been seduced by the family of the dead man to contradict Marilyn's mother's story. And so the will is being debated in court. At first, the woman said that Marilyn's mom was telling the truth. Now, she is threatening to renege. And so Marilyn looks like the murderer when this witness winds up dead with a knife in her back. Some of the characters who are in the episode but don't exist in the book. Country Boy Barnaby, not there. Dolores Cataro, not there. The Clark Kent look-alike contest winner, that is Marilyn's brother-in-law, not there. Old Donald S. Sanford dreamed all these babies up into good effect, which makes you ask the question, just why was the lonely heiress trying to reach a guy if she's not trying to find somebody who she can con? And the answer is, in the book, Marilyn wants to get a con man who she can seduce and then use to seduce the witness, the eventual murder victim, and thus control her. The murderer is someone who doesn't appear in the television episode at all, one of the kids of the dead tycoon, and the method of murder, as I've already hinted at, not prussic acid and a bottle of champagne, but instead a knife. Let's just say that the episode is way better than the book, and Typically what I've found is that the TV episode will gather together strings of Gardner's plot and tie them together in a more effective way in the episode. Well, in this case, Donald S. Sanford not only created the strings, but tied them together more effectively. The best parts of this episode are things that are not in the original book at all. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more, a Della is something about a particular character in the story, and a Perry is something we learn about our main character. Our poll this week concerns Paul's secretary, Margot, played by actress Gail Colby. We see her for the first time in the series, and Paul calls her out for her philosophical disposition.
Better get that check cashed before the ink dries.
Margot, I'm surprised at you. You're a cynic. Don't you trust anybody?
I wouldn't call Della a cynic, would you? Perhaps this says something about the demands made on a secretary for, say, a private investigator instead of a lawyer. Here's your research prompt. What other episodes of Perry Mason did the character of Margot appear in? And what actresses did the show use to portray her? Note, it wasn't Gail Colby. Our Della this week concerns Betty Lou Gerson, a.k.a. Agnes Sims, Edmund Lacey's lover and secretary.
He's here, lover.
Who?
Who do you think? Box 96.
Gerson, who is a huge radio star, steals every scene she's in, and we get a chance to congratulate her thanks to this line from Trag.
Lover, I saved your life.
Well, thank the lady. Thank the lady, Mr. Lacey.
I sort of feel like this is Ray Collins, who's no stranger to radio acting himself, telling the audience to take note of an expert performance. The producers certainly took notice. Gerson appeared in 2 more Perry episodes, and the next time we see her, she'll actually be the murderer. I think that's because Gerson plays the villainess so well. She may be best known to contemporary audiences for being the voice of a classic villain in the Disney animated film 101 Dalmatians. That's right! Gerson was Cruella de Vil.
15 puppies. How marvelous, how marvelous, how perfectly.
Trot that factoid out at your next Perry Mason themed party, lover. Our Perry this episode concerns Perry's exact suite location. When Paul drops by on his way to cash a hot check, he sees Perry just about to enter his office suite. If you're ever charged with murder in 1950s fictional Los Angeles and should have reason to look Perry up, you can find him in the Brout Building in Suite 904. You're welcome. Our theme for this episode is vengeance. Obviously, there's Marilyn Cartwright. She doesn't call what she's doing vengeance, but she's certainly taking the law into her own hands by hoping to get Country Boy in trouble without in any way consulting the authorities. This is always dangerous business. There's the payback that Agnes gives her lover, Edmund Lacey, when he tries to run out with all the magazine's cash. In true bad girlfriend style, she manages to both save his life and get him thrown in jail. Revenge is just the other side of illicit love, I guess. Speaking of revenge being the other side of illicit love, let's talk about Dolores, who completes this complex theme of vengeance and love. She murdered Country Boy, apparently because she loved him so much she couldn't stand to see him with anybody else. She denies being a hard drug addict, but she's been getting high on that Country Boy supply for a little too long, and when it appears she's going to lose her go-to dealer and go into withdrawal, she murders him. Yes, it is self-defeating, and that's essentially why the judicial system exists. Note to all you Perry characters, justice isn't something you can take into your own hands. Now, it's time for a Perry proverb. When Marilyn's stepbrother brings Perry to meet his prospective client, Perry listens to her story, then tells her to turn herself over to the cops. She's indignant. She's been conned. Her stepbrother said she wouldn't have to. This is how Perry responds.
That's enough, Miss Cartwright. You know, you're in a very precarious position. I can't help you unless you give yourself up.
Spicy! He speaks to her like a child and then explains his position. Marilyn's problem is that she took the law into her own hands. The steps toward her gaining her freedom begin with her letting it go. When she surrenders herself to the police, she'll show that she believes Perry can help her. That is, she has to learn to start trusting other people again and not acting like her lawyer is another potential con man. Frankly, this particular proverb is one that Mason could have used on a lot of clients. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Thanks so much to those of you who gave me feedback on the last episode. My Aunt Myra wrote me about the previous Perry Mason Returns ep, and she comments that she liked the summary of the reasons why the new Perry Mason in the 70s didn't succeed, and then asked two questions. What happened to Paul Drake Sr., and did some people think Raymond Burr was hard to work with? Aunt Myra herself found the answer to the first question. William Hopper died in 1970 while he was recovering from a stroke. He was only 55. We're not told in the episode, Perry Mason Returns, why Paul Sr. died, but from all the aerobic workout Paul Jr. is getting, it seems like a pretty clear case of a son trying to make sure whatever befell his father will not befall him. The answer to the second question about working with Raymond Burr is a little more difficult. Burr was an incredibly hard worker. When the series was shooting, he would routinely put in 16-hour days. And as the series became more popular and entered later seasons, he had more creative control. Sometimes his desire for how the character would act would contradict desires of the producers. And so Burr would occasionally do an end around by going to speak to the director about making changes to the script rather than working with the producers. This brought him into conflict, particularly with Gail Patrick Jackson, the executive producer for the show, the person who was Earl Stanley Gardner's voice on the set, and the person who had actually selected Burr to be Mason. Before he had lost 120 pounds, Gail Patrick Jackson was the one who saw his screen test and said, that is Perry Mason. Jackson's working relationship with Burr was one thing. Many of the producers knew that Burr was a talented, generous actor and could put up with a little conflict. Jackson's beef with Burr apparently had to do with her disapproving of Burr's homosexuality. While Burr's sexual orientation was mostly a matter of rumor rather than concrete knowledge while the show was being filmed, fellow producers and other people who worked on the show speculated that Jackson disapproved and her relationship with Burr was contentious as a result. That's why Jackson's death made getting Burr back into the Perry Mason role in 1985 all that easier. I received another really kind email from a podcast listener named Peter, who hails from Raleigh, North Carolina. Peter wrote that he began rewatching Perry Mason through CBS's All Access online library, which is a wonderful way to watch the show without commercials and without the routine edits that plague the MeTV syndicated series. He writes, quote, I never realized how complex the stories could be until I started watching the show as an adult. And Perry serves as comfort television to me. It's a way to be nostalgic of my youth and how life in LA must have been back then. Rewatching the episodes is like walking down a familiar street you haven't been down in actually a long time. And your podcast brings an added appreciation, helping me make connections about Perry's character, seeing his faith in his defendants, and understanding how the show differs from the books in often better ways. Thanks so much for the note, Peter. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this week's pod that you'd like to comment on or something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com, or you can email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Next time, we consider this conundrum. Why have Perry Mason titles that are premised on colors when the show was filmed in black and white? Just think of the Case of the Restless Redhead or the Case of the Crimson Kiss. Next week, our episode is the Case of the Green-Eyed Sister. Even if you can't really confirm that those eyes are green, you won't want to miss it. Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.